My favorite method of cutting tenons is with this jig on the table saw. So there's one cheek cut. To cut the other cheek, I could flip this piece around, or I could move the fence. Both of those are problematic because they're not consistent. Flipping it around, if there's any variation in material thickness here, as I go from one piece to the next piece, I'm going to get a different thickness of tenon. And if I move the fence, it's hard to move it back exactly to the same spots. A smart system is to make a spacer, and I've labeled this spacer so I remember what it's for a 3/8 inch tenon and with a certain blade that I'm using. And then put that spacer in there. And that gives me the tenon of the perfect thickness. And if that tenon thickness was off slightly, I would just adjust the thickness of the spacer so that I get a good fit in the mortise. And the thickness of this tenon is controlled entirely by the thickness of the spacer and the kerf of the blade. It doesn't matter how thick the material is here. For an offset tenon, I just move the fence the appropriate amount. And there's the offset tenon. Exact same width, because the width is determined by the spacer and the kerf of the blade. These bolts here grab onto these T-nuts, and there's ultra-high molecular weight tape, 2 strips of it, along that pressure bar so that it'll glide very easily. There's also 2 strips on this side here. And you put spacers in there, like bits of plastic credit card or whatever, to get that dimension exactly matching the fence. Another thing I did is I glued hardwood strips onto the bottom so that it would slide nice on the table, and put some wax on them as well. And I also used those to hand plane in order to get the thing to sit square on the table. Because you glue it all up as good as you can, but it doesn't necessarily sit square on the table. It just needs some very slight shaving on those strips. I used Bessey clamps. I like those because their pressure is constant regardless of the thickness. This sacrificial MDF boards are attached with double-sided woodworker's tape so they can be replaced easily. So the way it works is it sits on the fence, and if it's too tight or too loose, then you adjust those spacers on the pressure bar. I've got a comfortable handle here for pushing the sled back and forth. I cut the shoulders first before cutting off these pieces, and I'll show next how I do that on a sled. Set the fence so that it's just touching the edge of the sled, which is where the left-hand side of the blade would be, but the sled could still move freely. Set that as 0 on the digital readout, and now move the fence to the length of the tenon that I want, which is 1.86. And a quick reality check with a ruler looks about right. And now when I butt the piece of wood up to there, I'll get the exact distance for the length of the tenon. And that gives a very even shoulder all around, and each piece will have the exact same length of the tenon. When the piece of wood being cut is too long so that it would hit the ceiling, then I move to the sled method. To cut the tenons with a dado blade, I've got a scrap of wood screwed to the fence. Then I can butt the fence just up to it, do a 0 calibration, then slide the fence over to the depth of the tenon, which in my case is 7/8 of an inch. Depth of 7/8 of an inch as desired, and the tenon is square to the side of the board. with all the edges cleanly mating. If the mortise has been cut with a router, then the ends will be round, so you either have to square out those ends with a chisel or round off the end of the tenon to fit. The glue on this portion of the tenon doesn't really add strength because it's attaching to end grain on the mortise, and therefore I'm not too concerned about getting a perfect radius and fit here. A third way is to leave the tenon square, make it a little shorter than the mortise, and then just taper off the ends here to get it started. Apply the glue to the faces, which is where all the strength is, and then just drive it in. That closes in tight and locks the piece in place pretty good while the glue dries. Makes for a very strong joint.